The Columbia River Basin, home to acres and acres of farm ground, the mighty Columbia River, the cities of Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, and home to the Hanford nuclear site. As part of the Manhattan Project in 1942, the Columbia River Basin was chosen to become the home of the first plutonium production facility in the U.S. Hanford would produce the plutonium that was used in the atomic bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, August 9, 1945, ending World War II. But why here? Why in our backyard? In 1943, there wasn't much here, but the residents of the area had invested everything they had into the land and their communities. So why were they being asked to give it up? Why did the U.S. government decide the Columbia River Basin was the perfect spot for plutonium production facility? In 1942, the U.S. was fully involved in World War II, and the Nazis were in a full-on push to find the ultimate weapon. In order to stop that from happening, the U.S. had to develop it first. In June of 1942, President Roosevelt authorizes the top-secret Manhattan Project, an urgent program to create the new weapon. Now all that was left to do was to construct a facility that could produce plutonium on a large scale. But where? The U.S. government financed and oversaw the project, but they were not equipped to build and operate such an enormous facility. It turned to the DuPont Corporation, a major producer of chemicals and explosives who had a tradition of building its own factories, which made it a logical candidate to construct as well as operate the enormous production facility. DuPont had serious doubts that plutonium could be produced safely, so they insisted the facility be located in a remote area of the country. In mid-December 1942, DuPont executives met with Franklin T. Matthias, an Army colonel of the Army Corps of Engineers, who was put in charge of finding the location of the massive facility. In this meeting, they established the criteria for the location. It had to have an uninhabited rectangle measuring roughly 20 by 28 miles, not have any towns with a population of more than 1,000 located in 1,300 square miles surrounding the rectangle. It needed to have an abundant water supply, be relatively close to large-scale power, as well as have mild climate and a solid level ground. In late December 1942, Matthias and two representatives from DuPont flew over the area of south central Washington. The area in the vicinity of White Bluffs, Hanford, and Richland looked promising. After driving around the area, they determined the site was perfect in almost every aspect. Matthias recommended the area, and in July, the Army started proceedings to acquire the land. The majority of the land was already held by other government agencies, but 3,000 tracts of land were owned by over 2,000 individuals. Federal appraisers evaluated the land as mediocre to poor in quality, and so the government allocated $5 million for the acquisition of over 40,000 acres. The government exercised its right of eminent domain and took possession of the area that was known to be as the Hanford Engineer Works. The project was top secret, so people weren't told why the government was taking over the area, only that they had 30 days to get out. On March 6, 1943, the announcement was made that the government was taking over the area. The Kennewick Courier-Reporter announced Richland, White Bluffs, and Hanford area to be taken by huge war industry. Mass meeting called at Richland to explain the war project to residents. At the community meeting, the only thing Matthias could tell residents is, "If I told you what the government is doing, I'd be court-martialed tomorrow." The towns of White Bluffs and Hanford were emptied within 30 days. Even the dead were relocated. 177 graves in the White Bluffs Cemetery were exhumed and reburied in the Prosser Cemetery. The government came in and burned all the homes, businesses, and crops in the entire area. The only two structures left standing were Hanford High School and the bank at White Bluffs. Both of these structures are still standing today. The areas of Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland suited the site requirements almost perfectly, so our backyard was the logical choice. Unfortunately, the residents of these communities sacrificed their homes and livelihood to aid in the war effort. Some would call it an extreme sacrifice, but when you think of what could have happened if those sacrifices hadn't been made, it seems like a small price to pay. So the next time you hear about the Hanford site, remember why it's there, and the people who sacrificed so much for their country.